When we talk about the power of markets and how prices coordinate people in massive numbers to cooperate in ways that maximize social surplus, it's tempting to think that were it not for the explicit violations of the first welfare theorem, there really would be no need for governments and civil society. But that's far from true. Markets are built on the foundations that are provided by governments and civil society. In order for markets to function, property rights have to be respected and contracts have to be enforced, and governments provide the legal frameworks for that to happen. There also has to be a certain amount of trust, or otherwise certain transactions just can't happen. It's just too hard to specify everything in contracts that'll have to be enforced. And that level of trust is generated within the civil society. But then there are those explicit violations of the first welfare theorem, and the first one we mentioned was externalities. Externalities arise whenever there are costs or benefits from market transactions that aren't directly captured by the market participants. When firms produce pollution, they are imposing costs on others that they are not taking into account because they are not facing those costs. And whenever we have positive or negative externalities, markets either produce too little or too much. There's already a distortion present, and we found that now there could be distortionary taxes or subsidies that in fact correct for these initial distortions and cause markets to produce at the efficient levels rather than incur the deadweight losses from externalities. Externalities also got us to think about what we call the tragedy of the commons. When resources are commonly held, like the air, the water, the oceans, then there's an incentive for people to overuse those resources. People face what we call prisoner's dilemma incentives, where prisoner's dilemma is a situation where everybody knows that everybody would be better off if everyone cooperated, but it's in every person's private incentive to not cooperate. That's what the tragedy of the commons is all about, and it emerges from the presence of externalities. We don't take into account the cost we impose on others when we overuse resources. We then talked about how to solve the tragedy of the commons. Since it's a prisoner's dilemma, the only way out of the dilemma is to change incentives. And incentives could be changed by government policy. We could create pollution permit markets, for example, that explicitly create a cost for polluting that polluters will then have to take into account. And they have the benefit of reducing pollution in the least cost way. Or we could look to civil society. We ran into the work of Elinor Ostrom, who traveled the world and found lots of small communities that solved tragedy of the common problems without government solutions, by simply developing norms and customs that caused people to internalize the costs and benefits that their actions imposed. We then talked about public goods, and public goods are directly related to externalities. Think about fireworks. When we shoot up fireworks, we're providing a public good. Everybody can look at those fireworks and enjoy them. But when we privately decide how much in fireworks to put up, we're not taking into account the benefit we're bestowing on others. We're creating a positive externality. So whenever we're thinking about public goods, particularly excludable public goods, we find that markets have a difficult time providing those kinds of goods because they can't price them and charge people who consume them that price because the goods are not excludable. We can look to government to provide public goods and get us out of the prisoner's dilemma incentives that are inherent within the public goods provision. Or we can look to the civil society, but the civil society faces what we call the free rider problem. When we rely on each other to provide fireworks, then each one of us will try to free ride on everyone else, and too few fireworks will be provided. So unless civil societies can overcome those free rider problems, as they do in the solution for the tragedy of the commons that Elinor Ostrom discovered in many parts of the world, unless they can do that, civil societies won't be able to solve that problem, and then we look to government. Then we talked about asymmetric information. In many markets, one party to a transaction has more information about what's being traded than the other. We started by talking about used cars, but then focused on insurance markets, where those who are seeking insurance often have more information than the insurance companies. We showed how that can create problems in markets, can even cause entire markets to unravel, as in our example of the unemployment insurance market. And then we applied asymmetric information to the particular issue of health insurance. Health insurance is one of the most important issues for government because we have a sense that everybody ought to have access to health insurance. But asymmetric information makes that difficult. And so we talked about the problems that asymmetric information creates in health insurance markets and how government might approach those problems. We also applied asymmetric information to the issue of discrimination. Discrimination, we found, can emerge from various sources. It could be plain old taste discrimination, which simply means that people have biases or bigotry, and that causes them to treat different groups differently. But we also found that when there's been a history of taste-based discrimination, that history will have led to group differences. And those group differences can form the foundation for what we call statistical discrimination, where we take group characteristics as signals about individual characteristics, and we discriminate against the very groups that we used to discriminate against based on taste-based discrimination. And we talked about structural discrimination that can emerge not because anybody is trying to discriminate, but because of the way the world works. If, for example, we're hiring from just our networks, but past discrimination has led to segregated networks, we may not be discriminating among job applicants, but may simply not see job applicants from other networks, and so our decisions have disparate impact on different groups. Then we talked about market power. And we talked about the blessings and curses of market power. On the one hand, whoever has market power can take advantage of that power to restrict output and raise price to maximize profit. That restricts output below the efficient quantity and creates deadweight losses. But on the other hand, sometimes we gain market power by innovating, finding new products that people demand and value. And the only reason those new products are created is because the innovators know they're going to have some market power once they've developed those products. So there are two sides to market power. And then thinking about market power got us to think about different kinds of market structures. We talked about monopolistic competition. And we talked about oligopoly. And once again, we found ourselves applying the tools of game theory to think about those kinds of market structures. Then we said the first welfare theorem is all about efficiency, maximizing social surplus. But sometimes that may not be our only goal. We may want to think about issues related to fairness and equity. And in those instances, we may be willing to make a trade-off between efficiency and equity or fairness. We may be willing to sustain some deadweight losses to get to a more just society. So that got us to think about intersections between economics and philosophy, or normative economics, and how we might judge what a just society looks like. We talked about the veil of ignorance and stepping behind that veil of ignorance. We talked about looking at outcomes versus looking at equalizing opportunities. And finally, we talked about behavioral economics. The first welfare theorem rests on the fundamental idea that people know what their costs and benefits are and actually do whatever they're doing until marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. It rests on the assumption that people are rational. But psychologists tell us that in certain circumstances, albeit not in all circumstances, people have cognitive biases, present bias, bounded rationality, reference-dependent preferences are some of the issues we talked about, some of the concepts we talked about. And we thought a little bit about how that might cause us to think differently about some aspects of the first welfare theorem. how it might create a role for government or for civil society or even for markets. So in all of what we've done, in all of these violations of the first welfare theorem, we find roles for markets, government, and civil society, with each having strengths and weaknesses. The first welfare theorem demonstrates the strengths of the markets, and the violations of the first welfare theorem demonstrate the limitations of markets. But governments have their own limitations. Governments are subject to rent-seeking, to lobbying, to all sorts of inefficient decisions. We know that political institutions don't always necessarily make the best choices. And so when we look to governments for solution, we have to think about those kinds of trade-offs as well. And of course, civil society has to confront the free rider problem, and only if it does so effectively can it play a significant role in fostering cooperation.